Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another live stream on the History Five podcast. And today I'm joined by Dr. Robert and Price. And today we're going to be talking about, is the synoptic problem the Achilles heel for reconstructing the historical Jesus? I have the link to his book Deconstructing Jesus, along with many other books that Bob has written and published over the years, in the description below. And it will also be in the pinned comment after this live stream is concluded. A lot of what I'm going to be talking about with Bob tonight will align a lot with what he says in this book. So that's why I mentioned it. So Bob, thank you for joining me.
Oh, it's great to be here. Thanks. It's been a little while.
Yeah, it's been a little while. Would you basically agree with the way I titled the video? Is the synoptic problem, can it be viewed as an Achilles heel for reconstructing the life of a historical Jesus?
Yeah, it is one of the major giveaways that we're not dealing simply with relevant sources, as if, for instance, we had a diary by Jesus and memoirs about him by people that knew him. And so forth, where you could pretty well trust that though they were different genres of and letters by him, let's say, you'd have to say these are different sources, but it shouldn't be that difficult to show the harmony in them, or if it was the lack of harmony, some weird explanation for that. But the problem with gospel source criticism is we don't know who wrote any of them. There are just competing, unverifiable ancient guesses and conventions as to the authors were, or at least what their names were, and that's of no help, right? Because you've got a Gospel of Mark, the most common male name in the Roman Empire, and then another one by Luke, the second most common name, and so on and so forth. Even if these were their names, that doesn't really tell us who they were. And were they in a position to know anything? Were they written by eyewitnesses? Of course, apologists still love to say that, because their whole reason for studying the Gospels is to, as the old song says, have a little talk with Jesus. They think that the Jesus character of the Gospels is still available to them in spiritual encounters. And if one does not have such encounters, you're damned, and so forth. So there's a really heavy pressure on believing there is a definable Jesus who is up at the right hand of God and yet available to you anytime you want to pray, and so on. That totally distorts the thing. And when you get into source criticism, which many pietists don't want to get into, they realize that you're deconstructing Jesus. You're taking what they and what I once naively thought was simply a transcript of what Jesus said and did. I never even noticed the contradictions for a long, long time. And this is your Jesus book. And when you get into source criticism, the cracks begin to appear. And to define what the sources are, to read what source critics said, you begin to realize that there seem to be crucial stylistic and content differences between the portrayals of Jesus, between the different texts that hypothetically were combined to make the Gospels, and even within each one. And you begin picking it apart, not out of any animosity or prideful skepticism, like I always used to hear anyway, that people would say, now don't get into that Bible criticism nonsense, because we mustn't criticize the Bible. We must let it criticize us, which of course is just ridiculous equivocation. By criticism, academia means careful study, exposition, and so forth. Nobody's against that, but they don't want you to look too close. Apologists do because they're trying to keep them down on the farm. They try to minimize the significance of any of these things. Like some, like the sophisticated evangelicals that James Barr deals is absolutely great book, Fundamentalism. He talks about the sophisticated evangelical scholars who do really read widely and deeply and know an awful lot about New Testament studies or old, um, but they always manage to make it fit the Orthodox traditional paradigm, especially of the historical Jesus. And they still will try to iron out contradictions and minimize differences. They still hang on to any paradigm that will enable them to regard the gospel materials, even if they come from different quarters of the early church. They still want them to be deposits of the actual teaching of Jesus. And if they give that away, everything really begins to collapse. Not that that's a bad thing, because as the Gospel of Thomas says, let him who seeks not cease seeking until he finds, for when he finds, he will be disturbed. But when he is disturbed, he will learn to know all things, and then he will rest. Yeah, it's not a simple thing, and you can't take a shortcut and be intellectually honest. Well, now, what sort of things am I talking about here? Well, most, I think, probably still a majority of New Testament scholars would say that they believe there was, in the beginning, there was the Gospel of Mark, a collection of stories and some sayings about Jesus. And if they're very conservative, they'll say, and of course, this, as Papias said in the 2nd century, is based on the table talk of Peter, who was there and is just reporting what he heard. Uh, there are problems with that. And then Q, what was the Q document? Well, it might have been a compilation of sayings attributed to Jesus compiled by Matthew. He was apparently some kind of scribe, and so those would be very important sources for our understanding of Jesus. But close scrutiny there begins to dissolve what once seemed like the Rock of Gibraltar. Burton Mack and others have said, you know, if you really put Q, those sayings, under the microscope, you begin to see that a lot of this stuff is not even especially Christian in orientation. It seems just as much like ancient cynicism, with a capital C. And maybe this stuff was cynic material that Christians adopted and attributed to Jesus. Or maybe Jesus really said some of this stuff, but he was more like a cynic than like what we know as a Christian. So even there, what you thought was bedrock may be a yard of sand that you're trying to build on. And you start analyzing Mark, and you find out that, well, Jesus kind of sounds like a cynic sage like Diogenes, even in there, when he tells people to give up all that they own, which we don't intend to do anyway, despite our professions of faith. And so forth. So even the idea of distinguishing earlier, supposedly bedrock sources for Jesus, that gets disturbed the more scrutiny you apply to these hypothetical documents, these possible sources. And as most viewers of this show know, you can't really know if there was a separate Q document or collection. We only infer that it once existed by itself. because you can kind of isolate it from the narrative contexts in the Gospels. And that implies they were picking out stuff from a set of sayings, like the book of Proverbs, essentially. You can well imagine somebody could have written the Gospel of Solomon and picked from the book of Proverbs various things for him to say in situations where debating with priests or wise men or Gentiles or whatever. It's so source criticism is like the beginning of things. Another real problem is that when you find that these source documents and the final gospels, though so much alike in many ways, also have various great and small differences. Like you're reading along, comparing, let's say, the passion narrative, Jesus' suffering and death between the Gospels. Well, basically, it's the same story, but then, Pilate says this in John, but he says that in Matthew. Jesus says this before the Sanhedrin in this Gospel, or that in another one, or the prayer in Gethsemane is a bit different in Mark from Luke, and so forth. And you wonder, well, if these documents, our four Gospels, knew each other or their sources and differed a little bit when the basis of it is pretty similar, then you're talking about editorial tinkering. And that's where redaction or editorial criticism comes in. And you begin to realize that I don't even know that Jesus said this, or even if the editor or writer thought he did. Is Jesus being used as a mouthpiece for the ideas of the writer, just as most classicists think that in the later Platonic or Socratic dialogues, Plato is simply using Socrates as a mouthpiece for his own philosophy? I mean, stuff like that happened. How do we know? And so the more specific, acute scrutiny you apply to the Gospels, the more difficult it becomes to know what the bedrock of a historical Jesus was. And let me just quickly add to this, something very similar happened in the case of Islam. And a couple of later generations, there were several experts in the hadith, the traditional sayings and stories of the Prophet Muhammad, not in the Quran, not in the inspired scripture, but things that purported to be bits, nuggets of what he said and did that people remembered and passed down. But after a while, there was an inconceivably huge ocean of tens of thousands of these hadith or recollections, supposedly, that became as authoritative as the Quran. But even Muslim scholars said, wait a second, Muhammad couldn't have lived long enough to have said all of this stuff. It's obvious that pious people who wanted to add some clout to their opinions did Muhammad the posthumous favor of fathering their ideas onto him. And of course, devout traditional Muslims won't hear that. They'll just argue against it. Oh, no. If you become that skeptical, you're destroying Islam. Saeed Hossein Nasser, in his book Islam, I think, Ideals and Realities, he makes the same arguments that evangelical apologists make about the material in the Gospels. Oh, no, this stuff is all authentic, and we know that because it was handed down from the companions of Jesus or Muhammad or whoever. There's no reason to think that. It's just that something like that would have to be true in order for the present content to be deemed reliable. And of course, it's the job of apologists to convince themselves and others that it is all reliable. because if it ain't, you really have no basis to dogmatize. And people like that, as the Grand Inquisitor said in Dostoevsky. People, to a great degree, don't want the responsibility of thinking for themselves about big moral or religious questions, and they would like to think there's an infallible authority that they can learn from and thus secure their salvation, because they imagine that one day when they show up at the pearly gates, they're going to be handed a blue exam book and asked to take a theology final. There's an old joke where this kid sees his grandpa reading the Bible and a bunch of religious pamphlets on the park bench, and he's puzzled and goes home and asks his mom, what was grandpa doing reading all that religious stuff? And she says, well, honey, he was cramming for his finals. Well, that's what people think is going to happen. And they're going to quiz you and say, now, you believed in the Trinity, didn't you? Well, I wasn't too sure about that. Down the chute to the inferno you go. People feel like they dare not be free thinkers, and so they want an infallible book or an infallible revealer like Jesus or Muhammad or whatever to tell them so they can feel secure. They don't want to trust to their own understanding because, who am I? I mean, I'm no Aquinas, I'm no Plato. God forbid I'm no Whitehead. Oh, thank God. So that this is what people don't want to hear. But I'm afraid that's the nature of the sources and of historical inquiry. Most people are not interested in that, and they just want to have a so-called personal relationship with Christ, which I think is very similar to writing letters to Santa Claus. I'm sorry to be offensive. I know that is to some people, but I think it's really a fantasy and vanishes into vapor when you start asking what it would entail for Jesus to still be a human personality somewhere in the universe after 2 millennia, and listening to prayers of billions of people at the same time. It's, what is he, some supercomputer or something? They just don't think about it because they're afraid to. So oddly enough, the more you love and study this material, the more the possible answers are subsumed in a flood of questions to which there can never in this life be definitive answers. So you have to grow up, put away childish things, and say, I got to be honest with myself and with the text. I don't really know what Jesus was like, even if there was one. I don't know if I can trust what the Bible says. I can be inspired and informed by it and decide what rings true to me. But I can't be sure, and that's part of the human lot. So I've gone way off the thing, but that's the sense in which I think either source criticism, form criticism, redaction criticism, comparative religion studies, any and all of these things are Achilles' heels for believing in a historical Jesus. You just don't have the basis for that.
What about attempts to reconstruct a proto Mark or Marcus, proto Luke, proto Matthew, Matthew, Lucas? All these various hypothetical documents, also hypothetical redactions, unprovable changes to a text that's been hypothesized. All these complicated issues and theories about the development of these texts
Mhm.
can that also complicate things as well.
Oh yeah, I think there, as you're hinting at, these things are so complex and so debatable that you can never really, without kidding yourself, think you've struck gold and you've now got the real truth about the historical Jesus or something. it's not as existentially frightening as thinking maybe Shakespeare didn't write every one of those plays with his name on them, and so these things, what you can find and seek legitimately in the studies we do, is what I think it was Stanley Fish, one of these mainstream literary critics, said: you're seeking strong readings of the text, a suggested take on the text you're reading, that would suddenly throw new light on the questions in the text. Uh, oh, if I looked at it this way, let's say Hugh was originally cynic philosophy. That would really put the whole give away everything you own thing in a whole new framework. It would make me look at what's worth pursuing in life differently. But that's not a historical hypothesis exactly. A strong reading is one productive of new possible insights, new ways of construing the text. Uh, and it's not necessarily even determining the original author's intent, which you can never really recover. And sometimes when you can, you so in a letter, some author says, "Well, here's what I was trying to say in so and so book," and you've read the book and you said, "I'm sorry, but I didn't get that out of the book. I don't see what you tried to communicate. I'd really got something out of it, but I don't recognize your reading of it." I've had that experience. You have to trust the tale, not the teller. So even authorial intent, if you could know it, it doesn't determine the meaning of the text. Your encounter with the text does. And to me, that's okay. Like, I don't think we can ever know what Jesus was like, but like Albert Schweitzer said, I think I pretty well get a definite current of power when I read the Gospels and the challenges issued to someone who wants to live an authentic existence. I think I get that from the mouth of this character on the page, whether he ever existed in history or not. So a lot of the stuff can never be resolved, but may just be an intellectual mind game, though one I love to play. But you can hardly help seeing a lot of wisdom in Buddhist, Hindu, Christian, Jewish, etc. scriptures, and to me that's good enough. What more really can you ask? And it's intellectually fascinating too. I love all of that stuff.
Some scholars, actually a great deal more of them now, in the last couple of years, have been abandoning the Q document in favor of the thorough hypothesis, the Farrer Goodacre hypothesis that Luke knew Matthew, because Q is a hypothetical document. We don't have any proof that it existed, and it's more parsimonious to believe that Luke acquired the double tradition material and the minor agreements from his knowledge of Matthew. Thoughts on this?
That would make sense. And I find it fascinating that if you take that view, it will look to you like that Luke, that the differences in Luke, where he overlaps with Hugh or Mark and Matthew, whatever, will be, that's one way of doing redaction criticism. You say, I think I can see the pattern of what Luke was getting at in those places where his version differs from the others, assuming that he was dissatisfied with what they said and wanted to improve it. But if you think Matthew used Luke and Mark, you're going to think, well, it's really a question of is the Matthean distinctive, an improvement, so thought Matthew, to what's in his sources. And so what's original, what's subsequent, that will suddenly shift with the paradigm, the source paradigm you apply. And it's a fascinating thing that I can hardly keep up with. But it certainly does make sense. But an irony I think I see, if I even understand this much, is that people don't want they don't want to admit there was a lost gospel, the Q document. I think it's a kind of canonical anxiety. Like if they were to discover an epistle of Paul to the Alexandrians or something, would you add it to the New Testament, or is it too late in the day for that? Well, some people would prefer to debunk it and find reasons to think that we don't need to bother with this thing because it's just too much of a nuisance to try to redo the thing, reinvent the wheel now. I think that it's that kind of canon anxiety. What you mean there was another gospel, the so-called the Q gospel, and we don't really have it, not in its original form anyway. Oh, how could God let that happen? It's a tricky thing, and I sometimes suspect that's what's going on with these anti-Q arguments. That they say, no, we've got to have everything already, because if there's missing pieces, we're up the creek somehow. And so if you have one where you can say Luke used Matthew and Mark, uh, well, then aren't you positing that there was an L source that we don't have that was Luke's special material? Or if Luke was using Matthew and Mark, uh, I'm sorry, Matthew was using Mark and Luke, and he had his own M material. Oops, there's another gospel hunk that we don't have. Well, of course, we do have it in the text of the other gospels. So what difference do any of these theories really make? But I personally am not the kind of pragmatist, in quotes, that says, well, if it's simply an intellectual question, why bother with it? Let's just feed the hungry. No, we got time for both. Intellectual pursuits are wholesome and productive. But I have to admit, it does seem to me kind of a mind game, but one I love to play.
So, what do you think the most palatable solution to the synoptic question is at this time?
Well, I really still have loads of reading and studying and thinking, but I have to say that for many years, the Mark and Q two source hypothesis uh, commends itself to me. It really makes sense of a whole lot of these places where Matthew's a little different from Mark. Does that mean he used it and changed it? Did Luke do that? It makes a lot of sense to me. Now, when you get to the agreements of Matthew and Luke against Mark, I don't really have a problem with that either, because it seems to me you can explain most of that by scribal assimilation, like the way that in the Textus Receptus, the Lord's Prayer reads virtually exactly the same between Matthew and Luke, but in the earliest manuscripts, Luke's is shorter. What happened there? Well, as scribes kept making hand copies, they began to sort of go on automatic pilot. And so here's the Lord's Prayer. And since the Matthean longer version was more often read in church, this guy's thinking, well, I know the Lord's Prayer. I don't have to keep looking back and forth here. I'll just write it down out of my head. But he's copying Luke, and he's writing Matthew, or the oh, what's the other good example of that? I had one, and I can't think of it now. But these various differences may simply be inadvertent assimilations to the other gospel. And like my favorite example of that is, what did Jesus say in answer to the high priest when he says, are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One? Well, in Mark, in most manuscripts, he says, I am. But then Matthew and Luke, who on my favorite paradigm used Mark, each of them has it differently with a possibly evasive answer. You said it. Or if you say so, wait a minute. What is that? Are you saying yes or no? You leaving it up to the hearer to take it whichever way it sounds to him? Um, why would Luke and Matthew disregard a forthright confession by Jesus if Mark, their source, had Jesus simply say, You bet, I am? Well, what do you know? There's a couple of very early manuscripts that have Jesus say, You say so, just like what Matthew and Luke both have. And that makes me think both of them, either wittingly or unwittingly, uh, I'm sorry, that Matthew and Luke were simply copying from that reading of Mark, which I think was the original. Well, if you say so. And that later, some later scribes thought that Jesus certainly wouldn't have been evasive or equivocal. He must have said, I am. And then scribes began to copy that. So I think originally, and in my New Testament, the pre-Nicene New Testament, that's the way I have Mark. Before the Sanhedrin, he says, well, that's what you say. And like Bob Dole used to say in his debates with Bush, uh, he'd say, that's not what I say, George Bush. That's what you're saying. Is that what was going on? I doubt it. If I mean, I'm sorry. Uh, if Jesus had actually said, "Oh yes, I am," what's the matter with you guys? How would Matthew and Luke have changed it to an equivocal response? So I don't think they changed it. I think they an earlier reading, which does still survive by the skin of its teeth. So I think a lot of the Matthew and Luke agreements against Mark really are preserving the, let's say, the Ur Marcus reading, which was changed early on in the early days when from which no uh, script evidence survives. There's no way to know. I mean, the further back you go, the more changes you can trace in the scribal transmission. But there's a certain point where it breaks off, and we just don't have old enough copies to know how it read. And we just have to start taking educated guesses. And so that's the way I understand that. And that, as I understand it, the Matthew Luke agreements against Mark, that's one of the main props of the argument against Q and Mark. But I don't. I think it can undermine that. But I may be wrong. I mean, there's so much more to study by way of the synoptic problem that I haven't yet done. So I that's just like you said, at this time, that's the way it makes sense to me. But I'm open to change. I don't really have a dog in the race.
I'm gonna take some questions from the chat. Let's see. I saw one earlier that I wanted to pull up. Here it is. Napoleon Bonaparte. Dr. Price, was Marcion's gospel the first?
There's probably even more debate about that, but I have to admit, I kind of find Marcus Vincent's arguments pretty convincing, but there are people smarter than me, like our host Jacob, who thinks that's bunk, and he may well be right. Again, there's so much to read and think about it. I can only have a provisional, tentative view, but I kind of am attracted to the Marcionite origin of the gospel genre.
James Valiant asks, why was Q itself not preserved? Was it problematic?
Could have been, but actually, there I kind of am persuaded by those that say, assuming we have almost all of Q in Matthew and Luke, uh, people probably decided, well, why bother continuing to copy it? We've got all the material in these other gospels. And someone could say, well, yeah, but you also have almost all of Mark between those gospels, yet Mark survived. Well, yeah, but at least tradition tells us that Mark had the backing of Rome. And so nobody was at liberty to say, oh, it's dump this, who needs it? It's the Roman gospel. Whereas Q had no real authority behind the use of it. So they figured, oh, why waste the time? So that makes sense to me. But again, it's all theory. There's no way to know yet.
Let's see. X of Music asks, why is there some weird hope in reconstructing Jesus' life? There's no contemporary mentions of him at all.
So is there no hope, you're saying, to reconstruct the historical Jesus? Is that what?
Yeah, I'm assuming X of Music is implying that. Yeah.
Uh, well, people just feel like they. Well, this reminds me of what a Zen abbot said to Ronald Ayer on an episode of the old public TV series, The Long Search. And Ayer was a British reporter, and he asks the Zen abbot, well, I've been talking to all kinds of Buddhists, and some of them don't even think the Buddha actually existed. What do you say? And the abbot said, well, and I think he pointed to a piece of calligraphy with a big open zero. And he says, for those who need the Buddha to exist, he does. But for those who don't need him to exist, he doesn't. Well, I think that there are people that need Jesus to exist. If they have to rest with him being a powerful symbol, that's not good enough for them. And the reason for that is they're in it for the ticket to heaven. I hate to put it so crassly, which reminds me of what the Reverend Billy Saul Hargis used to say on the radio. Most Protestants go coach to heaven. But they think, if I believe, if Jesus really existed, and especially really rose from the dead, well, right there, that tells me death is not the end. And if I play my cards right, I can live forever in heaven. That would be concrete evidence of it. I don't just have to hope. I personally think it boils down to that. Because if you said, we can't know that, you would be reduced, in quotes, to saying, well, he's pictured as a wise man. Got to admit, a lot of what he says really penetrates. That wouldn't be good enough for him. And it's just insecurity, I think. And so naturally, they want to have that Jesus. Is it, they in the 90s, people wearing these buttons, WWJD, what would Jesus do? Well, that's a good question. And it really doesn't imply one way or the other whether there was a historical Jesus. I mean, I got to ask I'm a big comic book fan. I could say, what would Superman do? I know there was no Superman, but I have an idea of the character of this character. And it is sort of a moral standard. And so the same is true of Jesus, whether he actually existed or not, which I can never know as far as I can imagine.
David Lozano, thoughts on Q being equated with the Gospel of Thomas? Well, I'll speak about that for a moment. So I'm working on 2 separate papers I'm trying to finish up. I've been working on them for a long time. well, both of them will be going into the Journal of Higher Criticism, but one of them that's relevant to that question is the case for Proto-Thomas. Now, I don't like calling it Proto-Thomas because it's a hypothetical document. It sounds like that. It makes it sound like it's a hypothetical document, but it's actually not. There's manuscripts of an earlier edition of the Gospel of Thomas in the Oxyrhynchus Papyrus. So actually there is manuscript evidence of it. And one little clue that it's older is the absence of the word Didymus in the prologue in the very beginning of it. So it's not actually calling Thomas the twin brother. It's not trying to suggest that he's the twin brother of Jesus. But in the Coptic version, which is later, 3rd century, that one is making Thomas to be clearly the twin of Jesus. And that's how Origen of Alexandria in the 3rd century knew it, because he does refer to it that way. He knows that text is saying it because it was added to it by that point. The Clementine Recognitions knows about the Gospel of Thomas, and Papias did too. The Logia of Thomas, he knew it as he mentioned it along with multiple different Logias. How I reconstruct it, I'm not going to give the details of the reconstruction right now, but it's about 20. I think the original version, when combining all the evidence together, you can only say about 20 sayings. Just rounding it, it's about 20 sayings that go back to the original edition, which is significant because the current edition is about 114 sayings. So that means damn nearly all of it was created in the 3rd century AD. Very little of it goes back to the earlier text, which was very, very small. And to me, when I look at the whole, and I'll be talking about this in the paper, is it actually makes sense to me as a pre-canonical source because it's very, very small. You don't have the same kind of problems that Q has predating Mark, because some people argue that Mark knew Q. And it's called the free source hypothesis, where Matthew, Luke, and Mark are all using Q. And I kind of think it's a circular argument because Q is supposed to be material that's not in Mark, ironically. So if you have Matthew and Luke using Q and it's copying Q, then why the hell is Mark doing that? That doesn't make any sense. To me, it doesn't make any sense. I don't find that very convincing. But Thomas is so small. It's so absurdly small compared to Q that I can see Mark largely ignoring it because it's so small. But even then, there's actually some parallels between this text and Mark. So I think it actually works out given the size of the original text. And one of the things I do one of the things I do show that clearly wasn't the first edition. I'll just give one other example is "Blessed are the poor." That's actually there. And it's interesting because "Blessed are the poor" is used as an argument for Q. But I'm like, well, we don't need that anymore because I could just say that Luke was hearkening to Thomas 1, or we'll just call him Tom. He just used Tom, and Thomas, the larger one, is 3rd century. So Tom is being used by Luke's in order to regress off of Matthew's elaboration of that same saying, "Blessed are the poor in spirit." He didn't like that more enhanced formulation, so he used a more earlier formulation. But he got it from Tom, which actually existed, not Q. So Tom explains that without the need for Q. I tend to look at it as more of a modified Farrer hypothesis, if you want to put it that way, because I think Luke knew Matthew, both of them knew Mark, and a couple of instances where Luke might appear to be more primitive and Matthew can simply be explained by his knowledge of Tom without diverting attention to a hypothetical document that we just can't show existed. That's my response to that question. What is yours, Bob?
Well, I've never quite understood the claim that Thomas and Q were the same thing. I think that it's valid to say they are, as we picture them, the same kind of thing. Both would be sort of a book of Proverbs attributed to Jesus. and with no real narrative, but there's not a whole lot in enough in common between them to say that they were the same somehow. And I know there is also, I, sheesh, I'm kind of, my recollection is sort of dim on this, but I could swear I've heard people speak of a Z source, which was the material in common between Thomas and Q.
Yes, I actually heard about it.
Okay.
Not about that one actually. And now I fully remember because then I started forgetting. How about the N source? A common source for Q and Q and Mark. That just has my head spinning, and it's like, to me, I just lose brain cells at this point. I'm like, come on, people, are you kidding me? Like, are we gonna make up so many hypothetical documents? Are we pulling every English letter out of the alphabet? I mean, come on.
And this is kind of sawing off the limb you're sitting on. It seems to me.
Yeah, I'm like, that's where you lose me. We're heading into La La Land, you know. How many more hypothetical documents are going to be named after letters in the alphabet will it take? Or we start seeing, no, it's a problem, gentlemen. You know, we gotta like get a handle on the situation here. Trelazg, if that's how I pronounce your username. Thank you for your super chat. Jesus's question snap paternity strikes me as driving Jesus's compassion for those considers sinners and his embrace of God as his father. What do you think of that, Bob? I'm not even sure I understand the question or what's being discussed here, honestly.
Questions.
Questionable paternity. He specified.
Oh, that makes
questionable
sense.
paternity. Okay, I get it now.
Okay.
I get it.
So
he meant to say questionable paternity. It just came out wrong there.
What's his name? Bruce Chilton, in a kind of a strange Jesus biography he did, it takes the idea that Jesus was the mamzer, the bastard, the fatherless one, from the story in Mark 6, I guess it is, where Jesus goes back to his hometown. He's preaching in the synagogue, and somebody says, "Isn't this the son of Mary? Aren't his brothers and sisters here?" And some have always said, this is a sneaky piece of evidence that Christians were already preaching the virginal conception of Jesus, and they're sort of putting it back into the time of Jesus, that was being claimed then, that he had no human father, and that Jewish opponents of his didn't think that was true and rejected him as a bastard. And I think that's really unlikely, but who knows? But Chilton says, yeah, that's what they were saying. And Jesus was rejected because of that by his home folks. And that did create a wound in him that never healed. And he is saying, I don't know if he takes it in quite the direction you're saying, but there's one scholar, and a great scholar, though I have a lot of trouble with that book, that says he does think that colored Jesus, I guess, thinking and preaching. But again, I kind of think that's, if anything, it just denotes that Joseph was no longer alive. But in the Quran, Jesus is always referred to as Jesus, the son of Mary. And they certainly don't think it means that Jesus was a bastard. That would be, you'd get stoned to death for saying that. very big fans of Jesus, believe it or not. They just don't believe he's the Son of God or that anybody else could be.
Let's see if there's another question here. Let's see. I guess I'll take another one from Exy Music. He was asking again, in a sense, but be more specific. I mean, I thought he was being specific earlier anyway, but he's trying to ask where the excuse me, where the hope came from. Where does hope come from for trying to reconstruct Jesus?
I think it was Voltaire who said, if somebody made up Jesus, then he was greater than Jesus. Or you might say he was the real Jesus. I think people figure this character is so compelling and convincing, I just can't believe it's a figment of somebody's imagination. Of course, I could say the same, and I would say the same about Superman. But that really doesn't prove anything. But then again, what motivates most people to despise the Christ myth theory is, and there are plenty of people that, like Richard Carrier, for instance, who has all sorts of reasons for mythicism, and so do I. I think we don't think it'd be better if there was no Jesus and that Jesus was no good. Let's get rid of him. But I think a lot of people are not persuaded by the arguments and don't even know or care what they are. They just feel like, hey, I have a relationship with Jesus. Jesus is my savior. Of course he existed, because if he didn't, I'm up the creek. Like First Corinthians, if we have hope only for this life, then we're the most miserable of men. And he said, if Christ is not raised, then our faith is in vain. It's like a kind of a Kantian argument from practical reason. Kant said, if I got him right, that our moral sense may be just some kind of accident of our human composition. There may be no morality inherent in the universe, but are you really prepared to live on the basis of that assumption? Things would be pretty dark and nihilistic if that were the case. So I am not prepared, Kant said, to live on that basis. I am opting for living on the basis of the assumption that there is a God who created the moral sense within me, and that there's an afterlife in which righteousness will be rewarded. Might not be, but I got to go one way or the other. And life is more meaningful if you go that way. And you could say that the same would be true about your faith in Jesus. There might not have been one, but I don't know. And I'm not going to just base myself on the possibility that it's false. I'd rather base my life on the possibility that it's true and that he did exist and rise from the dead. I can respect that. I mean, you can't just sit on the fence forever. That's the real risk of faith, according to Paul Tillich. The anxiety of choice. To have an authentic existence, you must choose to commit. And you don't know because you can't know whether it's whatever your commitment is valid or worthwhile or true. Man is the measure of all things in terms of the limitations. There may be more than we can grasp, but who knows? You can't be sure there is or there isn't. So just go with what you have. And I think that's why people maintain a hope that this being existed and still does. I don't, because I don't feel the need for it, but I can't blame or much less ridicule people that do. It's none of my business.
I wanted to close by getting your thoughts on the identification, more thoughts on the identification of Q with Thomas. In some sense, I kind of agree with it, even though I don't really think Q existed. What I really mean by Q not existing is Q as conceived, as conceptualized by scholars, I don't think existed. But if Thomas is the start of, even if it's only 20 sayings long, the original version of Thomas, as I said earlier, about 20 sayings long, and it's the start of the sayings tradition of Jesus, which is what I think happened currently. Since it doesn't have all of the double tradition in it, I would have to say that Luke knew Matthew. So whatever Luke could not have acquired from the first edition of Thomas, he finished the job by getting the rest from Matthew, which was nearly all of it. He only got a small portion of it, a very tiny, small portion of it from Thomas. Most of it was acquired from Matthew. And just to be clear to the audience, the Coptic version, about 114 sayings long, is from the 3rd century, written by a Manichaean called Thomas, who was a follower of Mani. I believe that Cyril of Jerusalem, I think Cyril lived in the 4th century. I think he's right about that. That the evidence is there. It's going to be in the paper because I was comparing Manichaean thoughts to Thomas, and I cannot believe that not many scholars have really paid attention to it. In fact, they really haven't. I'm like, no. There's a lot of ridiculous Manichaean parallels to Coptic Thomas. Like, there's a lot of major agreements theologically, and when you read Manichaean literature, they confirm that there is a follower of Mani called Thomas. Cyril wasn't just imagining that. I'm like, this actually is true. I'm like, okay, that's got to be our man that created the 3rd century text. It is ironic because he does happen to have the same name as the original person that wrote the earlier version of the text. But who says that kind of coincidence can never happen, where someone changing a text could happen to have the same name? That doesn't happen often, but I think in this case it probably did. I don't know how else to explain the evidence. It looks like, as ridiculous as it might sound, that's what happened.
Well, didn't Mani say that he had a twin, a spiritual
Yes, a twin appeared to him in a vision. Yes, he did.
Well, that might be Thomas the twin right there, applying that method.
Yeah, but there was also a follower of his called that too. That's separate from the vision. That's my point. That's all in the Manichaean text, and you'll see the text yourself in the paper. That's all. I'm citing it. And so they have some agreements, like the idea that our bodies are imprisoned light. That's in Thomas, the Coptic Thomas of the final version.
There is light within a man of light. And so
just to be clear, I just want everybody to understand this. All these Manichaean parallels, not there in the slightest in the Oxyrhynchus version of Thomas. Gone. Not there at all. These Manichaean ideas were added later by the other Thomas the Manichaean, and this was done to make the original Thomas conform to Manichaean theology. And so there I actually agree with Mark Goodacre that the final version, the 114 sayings of Thomas, knew our Gospels. I think that's clear. But I think that the smaller version, the one that's about 20 sayings long, that's where I disagree. I think that one had to be older. And because his argument is that even the Oxyrhynchus version of Thomas, which he does say is earlier than our Thomas. So I have an agreement with him there. Where I disagree with him is he says those texts represent a version of Thomas that's still after our Gospels. And there I disagree. And I think that the Gospel of John was referring to the earlier Thomas that I'm talking about, Tom, the shorter text.
I love that.
So it's interesting because it makes Elaine Pagels and Mark Goodacre both simultaneously right. A version of Thomas did predate John that John was criticizing. That's why he called him the doubting Thomas, because there's no miracles in it. There's no resurrection of Jesus in it. And it's not really a resurrection in Thomas. What you have instead at the beginning is, if you read this text, which is in both the Oxyrhynchus and Coptic version, by the way, both versions. If you read this text, you will not taste death. Well, that means you're not even going to die to need a resurrection. You're just going to keep living, if you take it to mean that. That's not really a resurrection to me. I don't really see how that's resurrection. And then in the Coptic version, which is loaded with Manichaean ideas, it's largely about freeing your body. I'm sorry, freeing yourself from your body. Your body is a prison that keeps the light in chains, which is all over Manichaean literature. It's that's what's going on. So the text was reformulated to fit Manichaean thought. So I think it.
Okay.
No, actually, I think I'm done. Go ahead.
I'd just like to point out, if anybody cares to read it, I have a verse saying by saying commentary on the Gospel of Thomas that's included in volume 4 of my series, Holy Fable. The first volume is the Old Testament. The second is the Gospels and I guess the Gospels and Acts. The third volume is the Epistles and the Book of Revelation, and the fourth volume is modern Gospels. Gospels either written in modern times or rediscovered. And I have detailed commentaries on the libretto of Jesus Christ Superstar, which is very sophisticated. Tim Rice never got the credit he deserved from the way he worked the gospel materials into the lyrics. Also, the Aquarian Gospel of Jesus the Christ, a supposedly channeled work that's pretty interesting. And essays on the Book of Mormon, a commentary on Lovecraft's fictitious book, the Necronomicon, as if it were a real word, and the Gospel of Thomas. And so this is a big fat volume containing my comments on all 5 of these things. And a lot of it is the Gospel of Thomas, so listeners, viewers might be interested in that.
Jesse Pelez, maybe Thomas knew John. The Coptic version knows John, that I'm certain of. The one that's being preserved in the Oxyrhynchus papyri, it does not. I'm quite certain that that version of Thomas is older than John. So the 20 sayings version of Thomas, as I've been saying throughout the show, is older than John. I should say about 20 sayings. It's not literally exactly 20 sayings. It's about 20 sayings. And then the other one that's about 114 sayings is later than John. So I just wanted to repeat that once again. So again, before we close, a link to Deconstructing Jesus, along with a bunch of other books that Bob has written and published over the years, will be in the description below in the pinned comment. And also a link to his Substack page as well. And that being said, Bob, thank you for joining me tonight.
It's always great fun. Thanks a bunch for having me.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.